July 14th, 1942. Lucca Airfield, Malta, 15:27 hours. The sun hung over the island like molten brass, pressing the air flat and dry. Dust curled around the edges of the runway as 20 Spitfires waited for takeoff. Mechanics stood shirtless in the heat, their hands black with oil, faces streaked with exhaustion. For the men stationed here, this was the 150th consecutive day under bombardment. The island had not seen a quiet night since March. From a distance, the pilot walking towards Spitfire BR-301 looked like any other, short, wiry, helmet in hand. But George "Buzz" Beurling moved with a stillness that made others stop speaking. He didn't look around or wave to his crew. He climbed straight into the cockpit, adjusted the gun sight, and muttered something under his breath. Not a prayer, just a calculation. Control's voice crackled through the radio. Raid approaching, 40-plus enemy aircraft, altitude 20,000, course 170. It was the third scramble that day. Beurling's hands closed around the throttle. The Merlin engine responded with a high, clean roar. At 15:29 he was airborne, climbing through layers of heat haze toward the glare of the Mediterranean. From that altitude, Malta looked fragile, a rock just 17 miles long, burning at its edges. By July 1942, the island had endured over 2,200 Axis air raids. The Luftwaffe and Regia Aeronautica were trying to bomb it into submission, to starve it of fuel and faith. 60 Spitfires remained operational. The men who flew them averaged 5 sorties a day, slept 3 hours at night, and ate rations cut to half. Fuel was siphoned from wrecks. Ammunition was rationed, 60 rounds per gun, 3 seconds of fire. Beurling wasn't interested in the politics of Malta. He flew because flight was arithmetic. Altitude, distance, timing. He was 21, from Montreal, a boy who had built model planes and dropped out of school to chase speed. He'd been rejected twice by the Royal Canadian Air Force for lack of discipline. The RAF took him on a third attempt, mostly because they needed men. What they didn't realise was that he didn't need them. At 16:03 he spotted them, a tight formation of Ju-88 bombers with Messerschmitt escorts. 24 planes glinting in the sun. He climbed higher, up to 22,000 feet, until the world thinned to blue silence. Then he turned into the sun. The glare blinded the German gunners. That was the moment he had been waiting for. He rolled his Spitfire into a dive, engine howling at 400 miles per hour. The target flashed in his sight for less than 2 seconds. He squeezed the trigger, a 2-second burst, 480 rounds. The first Messerschmitt disintegrated mid-air, wings shearing away like paper. He didn't look back. He pulled up, rolled again, and cut through the formation like a blade. 8 minutes later, 4 aircraft were burning in the sea. When he landed at 16:26, his plane was riddled with holes, his fuel gauge empty. The mechanics stared as he climbed out, calm and unhurried. One asked if he was all right. Beurling just said, "Good enough," then walked away. That day, July 14th, marked the beginning of the legend. Within 13 days, he had claimed 19 kills, more than any pilot on Malta. His accuracy was unmatched, 1 victory for every 1.4 sorties. He flew as if statistics were the only truth left. At night, the island burned. Valletta's harbour glowed orange from bombed fuel tanks. Anti-aircraft fire traced red arcs into the dark. Beurling sat by the runway, cigarette ember flickering in the wind, and watched the horizon like a man studying a clock. He slept beside his aircraft because tents caught fire too easily. In his flight log, under the column marked Remarks, he wrote only 5 words. Still flying, still alive. July 14th. That was his way of keeping score, not of kills but of time survived. And in the sky above Malta, where death came every hour, that was the only statistic that mattered. July 18th, 1942. Takali Airfield, Malta. 06:42 hours. The morning heat came early. By sunrise, the air already shimmered over the runway. Mechanics worked in silence, sleeves rolled, their movements automatic. Every man knew the rhythm now. Refuel, rearm, patch, repeat. The night had brought 3 raids and no sleep. Out beyond the cliffs, the sea glowed faintly red where burning wrecks still drifted. Buzz Beurling stood beside his Spitfire, coffee tin in one hand, cigarette in the other. His uniform was faded, his eyes sharp and restless. At 21, he looked older. Too many dawns spent watching the horizon for black dots that meant trouble. The radio crackled. Raid forming, southwest. Estimated 40 bandits, altitude 18,000. He crushed the cigarette, climbed into the cockpit and pulled the canopy shut. The engine turned once, coughed, then caught, a deep mechanical heartbeat that drowned the island's morning quiet. He throttled up and lifted from the field at 0645, climbing into blinding light. Malta from the air looked small enough to miss with a compass error. 17 miles of stone, surrounded by an ocean that never stayed calm. Since January, Axis aircraft had flown more than 4,000 sorties against it. Supplies came by convoy once a month, when they came at all. The RAF's 60-odd fighters were all that stood between the island and starvation. At 0702, Beurling sighted the formation. Bombers in tight boxes, fighters above them, the sun flashing on their canopies. He climbed higher, waiting until they crossed the coast. Then, using the light as a weapon, he rolled into a dive straight out of the glare. The G-force pressed him into the seat. The engine screamed at 400 miles per hour. He fired short bursts, 2 seconds, no waste. The first bomber broke apart. The second spun into the sea, trailing smoke. He didn't count. Numbers meant nothing until they were written down later. The fight lasted 11 minutes. When he landed, his plane's skin was peppered with shrapnel holes and the right tire shredded. On the ground, the mechanics swarmed around the Spitfire. "How many?" one asked. "Enough," Beurling said, climbing out. He walked toward the mess tent, hands shaking from adrenaline, and poured black coffee from a scorched pot. Outside, the air raid siren wailed again. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the sea, a few pilots gathered near the dispersal hut. Someone mentioned that London papers were calling him the Falcon of Malta. He didn't look up from his notes. "I'm not a bird," he said flatly. "I just don't miss." By July 19th, his score reached 21 confirmed kills. The squadron diary recorded his rate: 1 victory every 27 hours of flying time. Statistically impossible, but the island was running on impossibilities. When night fell, he sat beside his aircraft, helmet resting on his knee. Over Valletta, bombers returned, dull flashes lighting the horizon. Each explosion vibrated through the ground like a heartbeat. Someone asked if he ever got used to it. Beurling shook his head. "You don't get used to dying places," he said. "You just keep flying out of them." And in the next morning's logbook, under remarks, he wrote the same 4 words. Still flying, still alive. July 22nd, 1942. Lucca Airfield, Malta. 0911 hours. The morning started with vibration, not sound. The concrete trembled first, then came the deep pulse of engines rolling across the airfield. Malta had been awake since before dawn. Bombers had struck Valletta at 0400, igniting fuel drums near the harbour. Smoke still drifted over the island, a grey veil against the blue sky. Beurling walked across the runway, his flight suit half-zipped, gloves tucked into his belt. He hadn't spoken to anyone since returning from the previous evening's patrol. He didn't need to. The mechanics already knew what to do: patch the wings, top the tanks, count the bullet holes. His Spitfire, coded UFS, carried 43 from the last engagement. At 0914, the warning siren wailed. Radar plotted 36 enemy aircraft inbound from Sicily. Ground control's voice cut through the static. "Scramble 249 Squadron, Angels 20. Beurling throttled up and lifted from the field with 6 others. Climbing through 14,000 feet, he could already see the enemy formation against the haze, tight, methodical, confident. He said nothing on the radio. He preferred to hunt alone. At 0923, contact. The bombers began their run on the docks. Their escorts dropped to intercept. The sky fractured into noise and vapour trails. Beurling turned hard, rolled inverted, and came down from above, firing from 250 yards, his perfect convergence range. A Messerschmitt disintegrated in one burst. Another flamed seconds later. His gunnery was mechanical, detached, no wasted movement, no hesitation. In the control bunker below, the operators watched dots vanish from the radar screen. One whispered, "He's doing it again." By 09:38, 4 enemy aircraft were down. Beurling's plane was hit twice, one round grazing the canopy frame. He landed at 09:52, fuel near zero, ammunition gone. The ground crew counted 23 minutes airborne. He lit a cigarette and stared at the holes in his wings. "That's 4, he said simply. The squadron's logbook recorded the engagement. Raid 714. 26 enemy aircraft destroyed, 5 by F Sergeant Beurling. Casualties, none. It didn't note that he hadn't eaten since the previous day, or that he slept in 2-hour bursts on a cot beside the dispersal hut. That evening, an RAF press officer arrived from Cairo. He wanted photographs, the Falcon of Malta, the young Canadian who was turning the island's defence into legend. Beurling refused the interview. "We're not done yet," he said. "You don't take victory pictures in the middle of a raid." At 23:47, the next wave came. 92 enemy aircraft crossed the coast in moonlight. Beurling sat on an ammunition crate outside the tent, watching tracer fire arc over the harbour. Someone asked if he ever felt fear. "Of course," he said, "but fear's just math. How many of them, how many of us, and how many seconds to the next reload?" By dawn, the bombers were gone. The airfield was cratered, the fuel dump destroyed. The Spitfires that survived were patched again. In the flight log for July 22nd, Beurling wrote the same 4 words he always did. Still flying, still alive. The island hadn't broken yet, and neither had he. July 25th, 1942, Takali Airfield, Malta, 15:09 hours. The sirens began before lunch ended, a distant whine that turned into a full rising howl. Pilots dropped utensils and ran. In seconds, the airfield changed from stillness to movement. Mechanics shouting, engines starting, the smell of fuel mixing with dust. Buzz Beurling didn't run. He walked, calm, deliberate. Helmet in one hand, cigarette in the other. At 15:11, he climbed into his Spitfire BR-301, strapped in, and looked once toward the horizon. Columns of smoke already hung over Valletta. The control tower reported, "Raid 200 plus, mixed formation, altitude 21,000, approach from Sicily." He checked his ammunition load, 240 rounds per wing gun, 60 per cannon. Enough for 20 seconds of fighting. That was the arithmetic of survival. At 15:13 he was airborne, climbing through the hot, turbulent air. Beneath him, the island looked the same as always. Craters, rusted hangars, the Mediterranean flashing like polished steel. He broke formation early. The others spread out in pairs. Beurling rose alone. At 21,000 feet he met them. Bombers flanked by Bf-109s, sunlight glinting off the leading edges. He pulled the throttle to the wall and came head-on. The first burst ripped through a Messerschmitt's canopy. The second caught the bomber's engine, flame rolling down its wing. He turned sharply, G-force crushing his ribs, vision tunneling to grey. In 8 minutes he shot down 3 aircraft. Witnesses from the ground saw 4 trails of smoke falling over the sea. Then his radio went dead. A 20mm round had torn through his tail assembly, severing the antenna wire. He fought on blind, reading movement instead of instruments. At 15:27, his engine coughed once, then steadied. He turned toward Malta. When he landed, the plane's skin was shredded, coolant leaking, guns empty. The ground crew tried to cheer. Beurling just nodded, climbed down, and walked straight past the camera team waiting near the runway. A correspondent from the Times of Malta called after him. "You're becoming famous, Sergeant." He didn't slow. "Not famous enough to matter," he said. That night the airfield was bombed again. The raid lasted 40 minutes. 2 hangars destroyed, 1 pilot killed in his bunk. Beurling helped drag wreckage from the runway. His hands bled from the heat of twisted metal. When it was done, he sat on an overturned drum and wrote in his logbook by flashlight. July 25th. Sorties 4. Planes 3. Still flying, still alive. By the end of July, his total reached 27 confirmed victories. The official communiques called him the Pride of Malta. and he never read them. He was too busy refueling for the next scramble. At 05:40 the next morning, the sirens started again. Beurling didn't flinch. He pulled on his gloves, zipped his jacket, and said quietly, "Let's get it over with." The war above Malta had turned into repetition. Days blurred together, missions identical, death routine. But every takeoff still carried the same question: how many seconds until everything ends? He didn't believe in luck. He believed in numbers, in precision, in staying just long enough to fight another day. And on Malta, that was the only kind of faith that survived. July 28, 1942. Takali Airfield, Malta. 05:36 hours. The sky was still grey when the first engines started. Malta hadn't slept. The bombers had come twice before dawn, dropping their loads across the runway and the nearby village of Mosta. The ground crews worked by lamplight, welding holes in the fuselages, pushing dead planes off the strip. At the far end of the field, one Spitfire still stood, streaked with dust and oil. Beurling's. He was already inside, goggles down, flight log open on his knee. He had written the date carefully, July 28, 1942. His total, 27 kills. His pulse, steady. The radio squawked. "Raid inbound, 50 aircraft, mixed formation, 20,000 feet. He closed the logbook, tucked it into the side compartment, and said into his mic, "Let's climb." At 05:41, the Spitfire lifted off the ground, climbing through pale clouds into sunlight. The island fell away behind him, a rock still burning from the night's bombardment. The Mediterranean glimmered below, calm and deceptive. Ahead, black specks grew larger, spreading into formation. The Germans were punctual. He approached from 22,000 feet, diving from the sun at 400 miles per hour. The first burst caught a Messerschmitt by surprise, its tail snapping clean away. The second pass, he clipped a bomber's left engine. The Ju-88 spiraled down, trailing smoke like a fuse. He rolled inverted, descended, fired again. Another fighter fell. By 06:02, 3 confirmed. Then a warning shout through the radio. "6 on your tail!" He didn't turn. He dove straight into the clouds, engine howling, wings shuddering. Bullets tore past the canopy. One hit the fuselage, another cracked the rear glass. The plane shook violently, but he held the dive, levelled out at 3,000 feet, and turned back toward Malta. At 06:11, his landing gear jammed. He brought the plane down on the belly, skidding across the strip in a shower of sparks. When the dust cleared, he climbed out, his face streaked with oil, eyes bloodshot, but calm. A mechanic ran up shouting, "You're hit!" He touched his shoulder. Blood, yes, but shallow. "Just a scratch," he said. That afternoon they counted the holes in the fuselage, 46. His Spitfire was unrepairable. They gave him another, one barely airworthy. He named it Hell's Bell. At 18:30, he flew again. In the logbook that evening, the entry read, July 28th, sorties 2, planes 4, aircraft lost 1, pilot intact. By the end of July, he was the highest-scoring pilot on Malta. Newspapers in London called him the Falcon. Headquarters sent congratulations. He ignored them. His only message to the commanding officer was brief. "We need more planes." That night, sitting by the ruined hangar, he said to another pilot, "They'll remember Malta because it held, not because we lived." The man beside him didn't answer. The silence stretched until Beurling added quietly, "But I'll take living, just for one more day." He looked up at the stars, the same ones the bombers used for navigation, and wrote his last note of the month. Still flying, still alive. July 28th. And above the black horizon, searchlights began to rise again. October 3rd, 1942. RAF Lucca, Malta, 07:25 hours. The heat had changed. The island's air felt heavier now, charged with exhaustion and dust. George "Buzz" Beurling stood by the remains of his last Spitfire, its skin pitted with flak and sand. The Battle of Malta was shifting. Axis bombers were pulling back, and new American squadrons were arriving with fresh planes and cleaner uniforms. The siege had not ended, but the rhythm of it had slowed, like a heart beating between attacks. Beurling's count stood at 31 confirmed kills, many within a 14-day span. a record that astonished even London headquarters. They called him Canada's greatest ace, but he didn't care about the papers. He cared that his hands shook every time he held a pen. He cared that sleep brought the sound of engines, the smell of burning fuel. By October 9th, orders came. He was to be sent to England. Rest, brief publicity, and reassignment. The island's commander, Keith Park, shook his hand on the runway. "You've done enough for 10 men, he said. Beurling nodded, unsmiling. "There are still bombers over Valletta," he answered. He left Malta on October 10th, aboard a Dakota transport. The island faded behind him, a burned stone in the middle of the sea. When he reached England, the silence felt unnatural. Streets lit at night, people laughing, newspapers arguing about politics. He was invited to dinners, interviews, parades. RAF officials called him the Knight of Malta. He refused most invitations. A reporter asked, "How did you shoot down so many?" Beurling replied, "I just aimed where they'd be, not where they were." He spent weeks moving between bases, Hendon, Biggin Hill, North Weald, flying when allowed, lecturing when ordered. Bureaucrats wanted him to inspire new recruits. He wanted to be back in combat. His superiors called him reckless, insubordinate. His reports called him a lone operator, brilliant but unmanageable. By January 1943, he was assigned to ferry Spitfires to North Africa. On his second run, he crash-landed near Gibraltar after fuel starvation. He crawled out of the wreck with bruises and a fractured arm, smiling faintly. "Plane's gone," he told the recovery crew, "but I'm not." He returned to Canada later that year, now a national hero. Crowds met him at every stop. Children waved flags, officials gave speeches. He stood stiffly beside them, hands behind his back. When asked what victory felt like, he said quietly, "Temporary." He tried civilian life, tried teaching, air shows, lectures, but his rhythm was gone. He flew too fast for regulations, too aggressively for peace. He told a friend, "They grounded me in Malta for rest. Now the whole world feels like that. Grounded." By 1944, he resigned from the RAF. He drifted between airfields and contracts, flying wherever someone would let him. His precision was still unmatched, his patience gone. The same man who once faced 60 enemy planes now fought boredom, paperwork, and silence. When asked if he missed combat, he said, "No, I miss purpose." He looked skyward often, not with nostalgia, but calculation, as if judging altitude, wind, and distance. The war had ended for the world. For Beurling, it hadn't. May 20th, 1948, Rome, Italy, 10:42 hours. The hangar smelled of fuel and summer dust. Outside, sunlight burned off the morning haze over Rome's Urbe airfield. A small group of men stood beside a silver Norseman C-64 transport, its propeller idling at low RPM. Among them, one figure seemed misplaced, compact, lean, in a worn leather jacket that looked more at home on Malta than in peacetime Italy. George Buzz Beurling, 36 years old, signed the last of the paperwork and glanced at his watch. He had arrived from London 2 days earlier, hired to ferry planes to Tel Aviv for the new Israeli Air Force. They wanted real combat pilots, men who'd survived chaos and still trusted their instincts. He was perfect for it. The war had ended 3 years ago, but Beurling hadn't stopped flying. He'd flown charters in Canada, test hops for private firms, anything that let him stay in the air. He had tried the quiet life, even marriage, but none of it held. "Ground's too still," he told a friend. "I breathe better up there." At 10:45, he climbed into the cockpit beside the Canadian co-pilot, Leonard Cohen. Routine check, mixture rich, flaps set, fuel line open, clearance confirmed. The Norseman rolled forward, engine roaring against the sun-bleached tarmac. Witnesses said it lifted smoothly, wheels retracting, glinting silver as it banked north. It was airborne for less than 4 minutes. At 10:49, the engine coughed once, twice, then erupted in flame. The aircraft pitched sharply right, levelled briefly, then plunged into a rail yard half a mile from the field. The explosion shattered windows across the neighbourhood. Fire crews arrived within minutes, but there was nothing left to save. Both men died instantly. Investigators found the cause later. Improper maintenance, a fuel line leak that ignited mid-flight. Beurling's body was identified by the pocket notebook he always carried. Inside, written in neat block letters, was a single line. Still flying, still alive. He was buried with military honours in Haifa, Israel, at the request of the government he never lived to serve. The stone reads, George Beurling, fighter pilot, RCAF, the Falcon of Malta. At the time of his death, his official record listed 31 confirmed aerial victories, all achieved within 4 months. But his legacy was more than numbers. It was precision under pressure, defiance without command, survival without certainty. In the years that followed, historians called him the best natural shot in RAF history. Others called him a rebel who never fit peace. His old commander summarized him differently. He didn't fight for medals. He fought because the sky was falling, and someone had to hold it up. Today, few remember his face, only the silhouette of his Spitfire banking over the Maltese cliffs. Yet every pilot who trains alone in a cockpit, every soldier who refuses to quit when the odds are impossible, carries a piece of that same discipline, that same defiance. He once said to a mechanic half-jokingly, "If I die in a crash, don't waste time feeling sorry. Just make sure they don't screw up the logbook." They didn't. It ends with his own words, still flying, still alive.